perfect. Okay. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and I have to say, I've always heard about the Brazilian high-risk cohort interacting in different ways, but hearing it all presented in a unified manner was just incredible. And I will also say, if it makes you feel any better, I know in NK-Rockland sample, we have lost an inordinate number of hours arguing over why I insisted that the first time point is labeled as 0, not 1, and back and forth. Yes, I'm very sympathetic to both sides, so that we can argue that out some other days. But what Giovanni asked me to talk about today is why open science can transform knowledge in psychiatry. And this is something that I never pushed open science as someone who's an overly idealistic, and from some people think of open science people as these big, great do-gooders, just want to give everything to the world, and that's wonderful. For me, it was actually a very pragmatic realization that if we want to accelerate the pace of discovery, if we want to see change happen in a more rapid fashion, the only way it's going to happen is to transform the culture. And so that's been a significant portion of my work over the past, I guess, almost 15 years now. I'm starting to date myself. But what I'm going to do is lay out what's the goals of biological psychiatry, and particularly imaging in biological psychiatry from my perspective, and really then look at what are some of the use cases that we've seen where open science has really made dramatic leaps, and then look more broadly at the impact using, here I'm focusing on functional imaging and structural imaging, which is where I live most of my time, but the same lessons have been learned in other parts of science, so I in no way claim that this is the only place to see these examples, but like everything else, the commonalities I think are obvious. So when it comes to biological psychiatry and imaging, someone such as myself, combination child adolescent psychiatrist and neuroimaging researcher, why do you get into this? Well, you get into this because of the promises, and the promises are always exciting. This idea that you're going to redefine psychiatric nosology in terms of underlying neuroscience, and whether it be imaging or any of the other modalities being collected, really taking on the major challenges that are known about the lack of correspondence between biology and DSM classifications, and really taking on the challenge of how do we sit there and have this neuroscience-based approach to identifying different subgroupings within the community, and then having these more homogeneous groupings that could be used for study and clinical trials and so forth. Of course, in all that, what are we talking about? We're talking about precision medicine or precision psychiatry. And in that regard, why do you do all that? Well, because you want to bring markers to the clinic. You want what every other part of medicine seems to have, some sort of objective laboratory test, some sort of growth chart, something to guide us in our clinical decision making. So it's less art and more science. And that there is really been the challenge. And, when you used to listen to folks like the former NIMH director, Tom Insel, was always very eloquent in pointing out that most parts of medicine, you look at a 30-year cycle and you see dramatic change, HIV being one of the best examples. Then you look at mental health. The last 30 years, you have not seen dramatic change. But, right now we are, and really for the last decade, I think we've been at an inflection point where we can potentially see that change. But, between the technologies, the varying capabilities, the advances in paradigms, but it all requires an accelerator. And that, in my mind, is what open science is. And as I was saying, this all is in service of precision, bringing precision medicine to psychiatry. So it's one of the many kind of classic diagrams of the fact that what if we don't take a one-size-fits-all approach to practice? And what if we had things to really guide us more than historical pieces of knowledge? And then the other thing is we also are in an exciting time in that we really are seeing the emergence of brain-based interventions. When you look at transcranial magnetic stimulation, deep brain stimulation, and other approaches, that's an exciting time. But also then, this is where neuroimaging, in my mind, will actually have its first and really the low-hanging fruit deliverables, where you optimize approaches using brain imaging. And this here is, there's a growing number of demonstrations of the ability to do this with TMS, DBS. It's an exciting time for what imaging can do as long as we get the methodologies correct. And then it's also, we have to look at, when you're looking at those next generation interventions, when you hear people talking about different genetic manipulations and optogenetics and chemogenetics and the what ifs there, we're always going to need non-human models to be able to sit there and properly evaluate these methods and really to advance the science and also applications in a safe fashion. And, biological psychiatry really has put a significant focus on creating those translational capabilities. And the imaging community in particular lives at a point where it can help build bridges going from rodents straight up through non-human primate to the human. And that there, when we look at all the systems neuroscience insights that have emerged in the last decade or so, if we want to see them translate, we need to actually develop those capabilities. And these are the promises of biological psychiatry. So then how does open science fit in? As I said, it's an accelerator. In some ways, at a bare minimum, one can say that it's nothing else. You'll increase your sample sizes, take on reproducibility crisis by having larger sample sizes, and that would be great. And at a minimum, that would. What I'm going to do is step through a couple of different use cases. I think try to emphasize just how much more impact there is. And first what I'm going to do is actually focusing on the autism community and what's happened with a data set that's called the Autism Brain Imaging Data Exchange, which was just referenced a little bit earlier, or ABIDE is another name for it. So ABIDE was inspired by an initial set of findings that came in late 2009 or 10, when we had first launched 1,000 Functional Connectomes project, and their aggregated data sets from about 30 sites around the world, openly released, over 1,000 data sets with resting state fMRI and structure. But it wasn't just about the fact that we were able to aggregate data and share it. We also put to rest a misconception, which was everyone's magnet is so special that you can't aggregate it. It was actually a nonsensical assertion. I mean, if you think about it, if we have something that can't be aggregated, then we probably don't want to be looking at it. And that's something that back then we made that point. And with ABIDE, the thing was, okay, great, we've done that. Now let's focus on autism. This here, spearheaded by Adriana Di Martino, what we did in the first round of ABIDE was collected 1,100 data sets from a couple dozen sites, and basically half with autism, half without. One of the key things is when you pull data together, first thing you notice is you automatically start realizing, even though we're all publishing on autism, talking about the autism brain, there's dramatic variations in age, in IQ, in sex, birth representation. These factors don't often get highlighted when one's looking at studies, and then you wonder why things don't reproduce. So this was something that we were very mindful of when pulling the ABIDE together. So here's the basic steps that we took. This is what happens when you borrow slides. You find out that someone has an animation. So the first step was really to scale the case control strategy. So scaling the case control strategy, what was the value of that? So here we had a larger data set than most had, actually anyone had published on in the autism functional neuroimaging community. And the thing was, you had a literature where people were saying, no, it's hypoconnected, no, it's hyperconnected. And we were able to just more definitively say it's both. Depending on what connections you look at in the brain, you're going to see different patterns, and that it's a more complex pattern, it's more of a mosaic. And that was an exciting thing to start to say, here we have something with more appropriate statistical power, we can put the pieces together, everything's openly shared. But then, of course, you also start to recognize the limitations. Go and try to do prediction with that data set and make individual level predictions, and you're not going to be overly impressed. You'll make it somewhere into the 60s, low 70s at best, with respect to accuracy. And so it also is a way of helping to motivate. One of the things that's also, though, is exciting in this is it does define new challenges. So when we take this step back and you start looking at the literature and where do people go with this, so case control doesn't seem to be quite working. So then what you see here is work that was led by Thomas Yeo. And this, I could have taken a number of other examples, but here's an example of someone who has nothing to do with the autism community, was actually applying these topic modeling approaches in Alzheimer's just before this, and basically he's now showing, using the autism brain imaging data exchange data set, that you have at least 3 neurosubtypes living in there. What's nice about Thomas's approach is there's a probabilistic approach, so rather than trying to recreate the challenge of drawing hard lines between these different subtypes, here's 3 different leading factors, and essentially you could express each of these subtypes to differing degrees in individuals. And just to point out the obvious, when one looks at connectivity matrices, up top you have the mean, and then you see the connectivity matrices for each of the 3 neurosubtypes below. There's a lot of information that's thrown away with the case control strategy, but without large data sets, you don't get to play new games like neurosubtyping. You don't get to ask these questions in a more meaningful fashion. And this is what the open data sets really help to start to driving forward in the community. And of course, when you take a step back and think about the disorder, it only makes sense, because what's autism most heavily characterized by? Heterogeneity, whether it be in the cardinal symptoms of autism, or whether you start thinking about language level, IQ, type of onset, medications, and also the comorbidities with autism, which are so often overlooked in studies. So it's something that's a more sensible model. It's something that lets us move forward more rapidly. And really, in the autism brain imaging community, it's been heavily driven by the availability of open data. Here is what from Adriana DiMartino, her strategy for how to approach the heterogeneity of autism. And you'll see the argument is you have a combination of a priori and data-driven approaches. What I'd like to point out here is we just look at a couple examples in this. Where does open data, again, wind up helping? So under AI priori approaches, you have psychiatric comorbidity and sex at birth. Sex at birth is an interesting one. I personally never had much interest in sex effects, but going back to the 1,000 Functional Connectomes Project paper, the Biswell paper in 2010, one of the things I had done there is just did what you should do appropriately, control for age and sex when combining the data. I expected age effects, and I was very interested in from a lifespan perspective. Instead, I found all sorts of sex effects that actually, despite having seen someone just maybe about 6 to 8 months prior presenting to me at Society for Neuroscience saying, look, with my 40 subjects, there's no sex differences in the brain, I'm sitting there looking and saying, yes, there are. And that's actually become a significant part of my work over the last decade or so, because you need to acknowledge these differences as well as others in order to better understand the variations that occur in the brain. And also when you start to then ask questions about neurodevelopmental perspectives and the differential rates among males and females with respect to ADHD, autism versus mood and anxiety disorders, a more complete picture is needed. Yet in autism, most studies would only focus on males, which is obvious from the perspective of the difference in prevalence between the sexes, but also is a major misstep for the literature. But then once you have autism brain imaging data exchange, you wind up having Adriana DiMartino, who steps forward and says, now with this amount of data, we can go ahead and actually start to identify sex differences associated with autism brain. But also what she did, she took a bite and then took 2 other samples and actually started taking on questions about reproducibility and replicability. And she's looking at robustness depending on which pipeline you're applying to your data, and replicability going across samples, and really applying much more stringent standards than what's commonly applied. None of this happens without open sharing and heavy interaction among groups. And one of the things is open data is incredibly important. So is the sharing of knowledge that goes with it, which means we need data descriptors and different ways of really making what's being shared more comprehensible to others. And when you go through these collaborative processes, you realize just how much work that takes, but the payoff is always incredible. Here's another one, and so this is Alessandro Gosti, Marco Pagani, and Adriana. Oh, I realize I'm covering up the pictures of people up top. But when here's work where driving forward initially from Alessandro and Marco, what they did is they took 20 variants associated with autism and looked into rodents, mapped out patterns of connectivity, and basically revealed that you see a hyper and hypoconnected subtypes that exist within rodent data. What was then nice is they were able to then go to the Autism Brain Imaging Data Exchange, carry out subtyping approaches, and there's a number of ways one can do this, and basically find that you do have within there, among those with autism, a hyper-connected subtype and hypo-connected subtype. Then looking at the academic game of leapfrog that happens, what they then did is took the Allen Institute's openly shared gene expression data and wound up looking at the patterns associated with the hyper and hypo-connected and wound up tracing it back to synaptic signaling and immune mechanisms that then could be related back to what was seen in the mouse. So here's an example of where open work really, again, allows us to go through this process and accelerate things. Adriana had done a systematic review of at the time, about 650 papers, and since then it's about 700 papers that have come out essentially since 2013 using the Autism Brain Imaging Data Exchange data sets. And what's interesting is, of course, you have heavy representation of resting state fMRI because that was one of the driving factors, but you also get a significant amount of structural, and then in the second release of Abide, we started including diffusion. But the other thing is when you look at the uses, what Adriana did was looked at how are people using it. So for diagnostic, when you look at Abide publications versus non-Abide publications, diagnostic group comparisons, so those case controls, the non-Abide data sets are more common. But when you start looking at classification method development, diagnostic classification, age-related effects, and a broader range of applications, they're actually all being driven by the open data. So the open data is driving more in these areas, which makes sense because you actually have the substantial sample sizes, which at bottom you can see they did comparisons of data sets with Abide versus not, and you wind up with notably higher sample sizes. This also nicely recapitulates the story that we had told in a Nature Communications article back in 2017, where we looked at the first 1,000 papers generated from the varying Indy International Neuroimaging Data Sharing Initiatives that we had launched at that point. And in those first 1,000 papers, we saw the same thing: larger sample sizes, broader range of applications. And actually, the one thing I will say is when we calculated in that paper, what would the cost be de novo for generating that same literature at that time? Is between $1 and $1.5 billion. Right now, we're working to recalculate that, which, given the growth of Abide, also Healthy Brain Network, and Ki-Rockland, Consortium for Reliability and Reproducibility, my guess is the conservative number will be between 2 and 3 billion. Probably, I imagine it'll turn out to be somewhere between 3 and 5. Incredible amount of savings. So let's take a look at another use case. So another use case is translational use case. This one I'm drawing attention to because this started most recently in 2018. We look at non-human primate community, incredibly valuable resource. Not much coordination between sites. Everyone said how difficult it is and so forth. So we put together a primate data exchange across, at the time, initially more than a dozen sites. We collected over 200 data sets, which in a literature where publications are 3 to 5 subjects in a publication was an interesting way to go. Again, the same story of everyone had their way of doing things, but what's the true data quality? We were able to actually take the data, apply uniform processing, uniform quality assurance approaches, and really step into figuring out how to put the pieces together. Here's an example of a few of the fruits. What you typically don't see in non-human primate communities talk about individual differences, but here we were able to take 3 different sites data in there that were some of the larger ones and look at individual differences, also look at questions about a weight versus anesthetized. This is the work of Ting Zhu, who, by the way, has never touched a non-human primate in her life. In 2016, we were arguing in our group about how to best validate functional aerial organization of the brain from resting state fMRI in humans. And I said to Ting, well, why don't we start switching and looking at the non-human data to go for the answers? And that became the beginning of Ting stepping into the space. And as another example, here's cross-species alignment work where Ting used the data sets to first, the published work that exists now is the macaque to human, where she developed a framework which is also now being applied in humans for doing function-based alignment. So not just looking at anatomical landmarks, but further informing the data on functional, using the functional data. But then there was recently an openly shared data set from the marmoset. And so as you see here, Ting has managed to sit there and now go from marmoset to macaque and macaque to human. The other thing is earlier was referenced the 120,000 subject lifespan data set. With Prime DE, it's now grown to where she's gotten access to about 1,400 data sets. And so now Ting has been working to map out the lifespan patterns of brain development in a non-human primate, which is going to be incredibly important for when we think about the future manipulations needed to really push towards the etiology and also evaluate critical periods and so forth for novel approaches. All of this is what happens when you have open sharing, as well as taking care of age-old problems, the ridiculous amount of time spent in extracting the brain from the skull in a non-human primate, which usually wrecks some grad student's life. Well, apply unit learning approaches, in particular a transfer learning approach to the Prime DE data sets, and Ting was able to come up with a relatively robust approach that only requires a couple data sets from a given site to adapt a model to be specific for that site. And I will say in all this, she actually took the openly shared human data set to seed the model. And it's just another example of where things go. So for the final piece here, how does, let's look, everything I'm talking about has been about the data, the science, and so forth. But let's really step in a little bit more looking at what the open community has been doing with methods, tools, and analytics. From that perspective, here's just a small sampling of papers from the open science groups in brain imaging with focus on data cleaning. The second you make your data open, the first thing you wind up doing is hearing what's good about your data and what's not, how it could be better, how it's not. You see who's only releasing quality control data. I always argue release everything. And you get into those conversations, and data cleaning becomes a significant focus and driver in the community. Also, you start hearing a lot more about best practices and standards and really seeing folks try to figure out how to put the pieces together. When you think about some of the things like you've seen in recent years, the way the BIDS metadata format has caught on. That was driven by members of the open science community who really are trying to condition things so that we can more meaningfully share. And you have conversations about how to credit folks, thinking about data papers and other ways of getting folks to have recognition. Then, of course, when you see some of the recent crises that the imaging community has gone through with statistical thresholding, of course, it's always great when I look at what data did they use, and it's like, great, that's the data we shared. But the thing is, those crises, what they're doing is taking data and looking at it and really trying to figure out what's true and what's not, and they're moving the field forward. And to be fair, those crises apply to any data set. But when they have large data sets that actually contain data from numerous different sites, it makes the argument much more powerful in people's minds. And it also helps them to resolve things. And so that's been an exciting range of uses. And then also revisiting minimum data requirements for reliable findings. Some years ago, we had developed and shared the Healthy Brain Network Serial Scanning Initiative, where you have large amounts of data per subject, actually 120 minutes per subject for each of 4 different data types. And we went through looking at what's the minimum amount of data required to actually get reliable data. And then there was a recent paper, that is a more recent paper I followed from Maxwell Elliott, looking and making the same points and pushing a bit further, arguing that stop worrying so much about what scan state you used and look at the amount of the quantity of data you used. That's the primary driver. Then comes issues related to your scan state. These kind of revisions, when you have this, what you're able to do is, because the data is openly shared, one's able to grab it, and then with any new method, they're able to say, fine, give me 10, 20, 30, 40 minutes. And nowadays you have the Midnight Scan Club, which is another one of these densely sampled data sets. So really, there's no reason someone should be publishing a new method without having gone through and actually done the hard work of figuring out how much data is actually needed. And also that helps guide the future data collection so we don't make the same mistakes. Pipeline optimization, here's an example. This is Gael Veracqua and colleagues who took on the challenge of autism diagnosis prediction. Here, though, what was interesting is they didn't just try to optimize for predicting within the sites you've seen. They actually used an inter-site prediction model where the test set had sites that were not included in the training set, which is a more challenging one, but a more real-world application. And they basically showed that as you ramped up the number of data sets available for training, inter-site prediction started to rival that of intra-site prediction, and that in my mind was an inspiring finding. And then here you have, this is Joshua Vogelstein and colleagues, where they basically took an openly shared tool, CPAC, which is designed to allow you to iterate over a range of pipeline choices, and they constructed in that platform 64 different pipelines and applied it to all the data sets available in a consortium for reliability and reproducibility, which are all pretest data sets, and then focused on reliability, went through and tried to figure out what decisions matter and which ones don't in resting state fMRI pre-processing. Oops, something happened here with my slides. Okay, there we go. Another set of examples of what can be done is here's work by Greg Keir and the colleagues over at Child Mind, where we've been taking on the challenge of how to actually figure out when we are looking at the same exact, when we think we're looking at the same base pre-processing steps in minimal pre-processing pipelines like fMRI prep or CPAC or ABCD pipeline and CCS or DPARS or DPABI. With any of these, even though it looks like you're using the same base minimal pre-processing, we actually wind up showing that your reliabilities could be dramatically lower than desired when using the same exact data from the same subjects. Just the steps like brain extraction, anatomic alignment, these minimal steps actually, it looks like you're doing the same things, but we all know they're not. Everyone's doing it their way. And so some part of that is really drawing attention to that. And then actually there's a preprint that lives over in bioRxiv where we basically show that you can overcome the problem by actually then going through and identifying the sources and also having reference pipelines. But the other thing is, it also creates exciting opportunities, because what happens is you wind up in a situation where you can try to use the variance among pipelines to actually come up with more robust predictions. And that's the line of work that Greg Keir has been pursuing. And also behavioral phenotype harmonization. This is where we're trying to put together the Brazilian high-risk cohort, Healthy Brain Network, Philadelphia Neurodevelopmental Cohort, NKI-Rockland, Chinese colonists, so forth. And you decide that the hard part is probably phenotyping. You call Giovanni. And between Maurizio Hoffman and Giovanni, you wind up with a series of papers trying to figure out how just a simple idea of, well, why don't we just use the body factor model based on the child behavior checklist? But won't that be easy? And then you have Giovanni get into all of what makes it difficult, what doesn't, how do you deal with the one site that didn't? And you wind up with a series of papers inspired on how to solve the challenges, on how to put things together. And also scalable quality control methods. This is work for a reproducible brain chart project with trying to figure out how you take on all these varying data sets and come up with approaches that are automated. And so this is here with Nathalia Espers and Alex Franco, along with Ted Sathwaite and others, really trying to put the pieces together to come up with frameworks that could make data quality control in an open space easy and crowdsourceable. And finally, understanding sample composition. When we did autism brain imaging data exchange 1 versus 2, just because they both have the same number of subjects in it, it doesn't actually mean you have the same populations. And that when one looks at the compositions in between the first wave and second wave, essentially of data aggregation, the community had shifts in the age being examined and also in the levels of function being brought in. And this is something that then you have to work to reconcile. So just to finish up, because am I out of time or within a few minutes? 5 minutes, perfect. Then we're good. Okay, so what's on the horizon? One of the things that we've really been inspired by, actually, again, a fruit of open data sharing, was when we released a Healthy Brain Network data set, which really contains a range of multimodal data. It's not just multimodal imaging, it's EEG, it's eye tracking, it has actigraphy, EMA, the kind of things, the kind of breadth of that's what's been spoken about for a Brazilian high-risk cohort. At the time, Scott McKeague reached out to me because he was interested that we had EEG and eye tracking at the same time. And he then got me to start looking at the mobile brain body imaging, or MOBI framework that he'd been writing about for the last decade, and he built into EEG Lab, which is really this idea: if you want to characterize natural behavior, what you need to do is think much more broadly in characterizing behavior. You have to look at gaze dynamics, brain dynamics, body dynamics. You need to get a range of data acquisitions, and actually you want to do them simultaneously, which at first I looked at and said, that sounds like a lot of hard work. But it's also a lot of hard work using behavioral phenotypes that are suboptimal and really have not really helped us to truly characterize mental health or learning disorders. So in that vein, what we've done is the new NK-Rockland sample, which launched a couple years ago. We took Scott's idea and basically worked to scale it. So here, this is going to be 600 subjects, not the initial 1,000 or so that we did when we were just doing imaging. But in addition to the multimodal imaging cohort, which has everything we're excited about most nowadays, we have these MOBI sessions where folks have these many sensors simultaneously on them. And what they're doing is they're doing a range of tasks like what you're seeing here, that, these are being done on tablets where we're capturing every single frame of what's being drawn. So these tasks, which they're much more slated towards motor and or what's being done in clinics, what's happening is it gives us a very rich data set for capturing and characterizing the person's behavior. First, from the actual product, an example, you see spiral drawing, letter drawing, complex the complex figure drawing task, trails A, trails B, flanker task, continuous performance task. But you have all that data now being captured digitally, not on pieces of paper. And then what you also have is the many sensors simultaneously. So it creates a whole, essentially it's a machine learner's paradise, but it creates a whole new framework for trying to figure out what signals matter, trying to also think about how do we get signals that could be translated into more practical applications between smartphones and sensors. And then finally, stationary versus mobile phenotyping. We're putting increasing investment on mobile phenotyping. And in that regard, of course, actigraphy is a significant focus of ours. Kathleen Merrick-Hengis has really driven that one, any ecologic momentary assessment into our heads. But in order to do that, what we're doing is the MindLogger platform, which as Pedro said a bit earlier, it now works. What's happened there is we've spent a year refactoring. So it's been almost completely rewritten underneath to basically take the kind of technical debt you have from academic and freelance developers over the course of 5 years, and basically having an agency dedicate dozens of programmers to sit there and work intensively. So we just had the refactored version released about a week ago. We anticipate spending the next 2 to 4 weeks figuring out whatever bugs we find it goes out into real world. And then what will happen is there'll be much larger investments in expanding the more bleeding edge of MindLogger. But one of the exciting things I'll finish up on is the laboratory tests that I was talking about in NKI-Rockland with all the multiple modalities and everything, they're also being done using MindLogger, which means we now have a framework that we could do in-lab testing with the many modalities, and there are things we've done with lab streaming layers and so forth to actually combine the data more in the moment. And then that same tool can be used out in the community. So it creates more of a link between in-lab and at-home settings. And that's something that we will be taking inputs really over the next couple months as we think of finally how we're going to allocate the next year's worth of software development time. But we're pretty excited about where things are going. We could put much more of a focus on cognitive burst sampling, biometrics, and also building interventions like single session interventions into MindLogger. And eventually we're supposed to do more closed loop style like social rhythms therapy approaches in MindLogger. So this is meant to really be an open framework and something that we will, as always, take input on. With open science, what you do is you first torture yourself with your product and then everyone else suffers with you. So if you've tortured yourself enough, which I argue with MindLogger, no one suffered more than me. But then when you get to the product you really want, then really it could be incredibly useful. The same is true for data, which I could go through the many iterations of data, of errors that come out in open data that we've shared over the years that we've worked to correct. But it's part of an iterative process, and we do welcome input and involvement throughout it. So with that, I will finish on on this one here. This is an open competition. This is one of a series. This one's close to done. But this competition here is a Kaggle-based one for prediction of sleep states, or sleep basically onset and offset from actigraph watches. We're going to be conducting a series of these competitions through the SNF Global Center, as well as a California initiative we have that will be making these competitions ways of helping to drive the community towards exciting topics or challenges. This one here, there's over 1,300 teams taking on this challenge, and at the end what we will have is a set of open algorithms that we will build into open platforms and allow everyone to get further involved in. So I think that vision of driving particular challenges to the community, not just through data, but through analytic challenges, is where we are going. With that, I'm done.
Thank you very much, Mike. Very inspiring talk. So we're having a small change of order. We are having first Giovanni, Professor Giovanni Salum. Giovanni is also an old face, an old collaborator, a professor of psychiatry in the Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, and currently he is the director of the SNF Global Center for Child and Adolescent Mental Health at the Child Mind Institute. So this is going to describe the program.
So hello everyone. So as I said, earlier this morning, I really feel at home here. So, and I feel that now I'm kind of introducing my new friends to everyone, and part of friends and family. Mike now, we live in the same building, the same floor. He's 20A and I'm 20H. So it's really like a family, and the reason I'm mentioning that, so me and Mike are co-directing this center, this SNF Global Center, and the reason and he's a big part of the reason I went to CMI 3 years ago. First, because he identified an opportunity when we started working together in the Brazilian High Risk in the HBN data. Mike invited me to go there to New York because he was starting the Healthy Brain Network, a big study, and he heard about the Brazilian high risk cohort from Tomás Paus, I think, that was here with us. And then I went there and I was, blown away with the HBN and everything that was going on there. And Kathleen was there. And Kathleen, if everyone that knows Kathleen, that everything is like catalyzed by 10 times. And I realized there, and then we started working together and doing new scales and instruments. And then at some point, I was invited to coordinate the mental health sector of my city, Porto Alegre. And then I left academia for 2 years, and I was like really investing my time in doing work at the mental health sector. And it really changed my life because I loved it. And then my wife said, it's either the city or me. So I saved my marriage and continued, but I changed my career. And during that time, I was like seeing Mike in meetings because I was still going to neuroscience meetings. And then Mike said, oh, I have a friend that's doing this public health. He seems miserable, so like perhaps that's a good opportunity. So I started coordinating a project in Greece, and that led, which is a capacity building program, it's about public health and training, and that led to the SNF Global Center. And then a year ago, I moved to New York City to be working at Child Mind and help out creating an area of global mental health. And the reason there's two main reasons I end up moving this career. It was a big career change for me. I was happy in Porto Alegre and doing things that I liked, and was having funding to the research finally, doing big projects with the Ministry of Health and etc. But there was two main things that were important. One of them is the opportunity to be learning from other countries and understanding how other systems work and how that could be informative. and the second was about Mike. So I like him very much, and he was very kind. He was one of the kindest persons that I knew, and not prejudicial at all. Sometimes when you're collaborating, you're like, yeah, but you're from a low-income country. I don't really trust you. Like there's also like a 1%, 2%, sometimes 30% prejudice, and I never felt that with him. And he really focuses on the problem, and he doesn't care who says about the problem. He doesn't care about anything but the truth. And I think that's a real scientist attitude. And the second is connectivity. Like, do you see the approach that he's taking for neuroscience? It's about engaging and changing culture, right? And I think in child psychiatry, that's the only way. There's no way for us to be doing something that's going to advance anything if we are not building a better community. Our community in child mental health, in a more general sense, is not that integrated as neuroscience, for example. Almost nothing is shared. A lot of the training protocols are behind paywalls, so the people don't have access to things that work to help their lives. So that would motivate, I think, me and a lot of the people here, like Shirley, Sam, Victor, and Mike, to be trying to be infusing this idea of openness and changing communities and cultures to address public health problems as well. So I'm very proud to be presenting here today, and I think, as Euripides said, I also believe in that, and what this experience in Greece taught me is that trust is the main thing. I think the only reason it worked in Greece was because the trust between the director there and with us at Child Mind, Anastasia Koumoulas, a 70-year-old woman that spent 40 years of her career doing work and changing the system in Greece, and a lot of people wanting to do change and with resources to do change. So I think here we are very proud, I think, of putting a lot of people together, and I think we're very happy that we are here at USP, and we went yesterday to URGS, which is much better, to be like for helping catalyze this community. And I think CISME is in the same vein since the beginning. So it's a very nice opportunity for us to be exchanging things and ways that we can work together. So I'm presenting this SNF Global Center for Child and Adolescent Mental Health at the Child Mind Institute. That is part of a funding from the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. It's a Greek foundation. And they have multiple projects: infrastructure projects, procurement of equipment projects, mental health, training, knowledge exchange and partnerships, science, technology, and innovation. And they're investing $1 billion+ in the health sector. In Greece, they're building 2 hospitals. This hospital here is in Thessaloniki. One big is a general hospitals. It's not like psychiatric hospitals, but they have a unit in child psychiatry. And because of that, given the SNF has been promoting and investing and donating resources to the Child Mind for years, they said, it's not only about building structures, it's about training your workforce. So they reach out to the Child Mind to be doing that, and that was the beginning of the Greek project. And it's a very beautiful capacity building program that you share decision making with people, you think about how you can do change collectively, and how you produce resources that can be feasible in the public sector, right? So just a bit of 2 cents about the Child Mind Institute. I feel a bit funny saying that with Mike here, because Mike was the one that was there since the beginning, 14 years ago. But just to say, for you to get to know what CMI is, CMI has 3 main areas of training areas. One area is care, so it's a clinic in New York City and also in the San Francisco Bay Area that uses evidence-based treatments for seeing children there. So that's a clinical work. The second piece is education. So it includes education at multiple schools and community center and communities in New York and other states in the U.S. in a very powerful psychoeducation and public awareness platform. The website that CMI has 2 million access a month. So CMI has a lot of impressions in the media, and it's really about shaping the discourse about mental health in the US, which is not only about, knowledge. It's about changing your perspective societally to see we need to fund those things. We need to understand what's going on. We need to engage this community, and this is about talking with your audience, talking with the population for that to be. It's not about the prevention strategy. It has a preventative element, but that has a broader impact of changing a culture and building awareness about something that's important. And I'm very happy that Rodrigo is here as well, because Opportumities in multiple ways is really connected, I think, with very similar in trying to do that for Brazil. And we are very happy also to be talking with Opportumities and IEPS and Telesaúde to see how we can help in this discourse here in Brazil as well. And the last piece is science, and Mike presented. And that's the thing, it's so much, but it's a small fraction actually of what's being done there. And that's the thing I was talking about, the reasons, and the reasons I went there is also about to learn different ways of thinking. Mike's extremely successful, and I consider myself, my career is doing well, but I couldn't think about anyone that thinks more differently than me. If you see his desktop, it's like a zillion files all over that would cause me anxiety, like a panic attack. I'm very obsessive, there's no files out of order and those kinds of things. So, but as Shirley will say to us, the way to get with those things is exposure, right? So I wanted to be exposed myself to be growing. That's the way I think the only way for us to grow is to understand our inner strengths, but also understand what the world can offer you, right? And I think that's about relationships. So the SNF Global Center, as I mentioned, our vision is envisioning a world in which children and adolescents struggling with mental health and learning disorders and their families can readily access high-quality information, resources, and care. And our mission is to systematically increase access, quality, and equity in child and adolescent mental health care. So we aim to do that by means of 6 initiatives in this project. The first one is about data. It's like global landscape mapping. So as you know, although we have some of the numbers and etc., our data about mental health in the world is very fragile. Most of the data we have is from high-income countries. Most of the low-income countries don't have any data. And as Mike was saying, those challenges of data aggregation, even from epidemiological data, are very difficult. All the epidemiological data we have from the global burden of disease, for example, although they are very, the best we have, they are using different instruments, different time frames, different sampling, different everything, right? So we have sometimes little confidence on those estimates that they're really representing things, and I think that prevents us also as a society to understand what are the meta structures that affect the data variations, right? And we don't really know. In mental health in children, that's still a big if. And that's important to address it. So we are trying to do a global survey, at least in 26 countries, and potentially more. And the way we are trying to do that is with partnerships with UNICEF, WHO. We are trying to get a partnership with an existing survey called MIXT, Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey, that has 70 countries, that goes to 70 countries every 3 years, in ways to have a vigilance system to be tracking data over time with a combination of panel data, which is bad data, and good data, which is mixed data, the probabilistic sample with good response rates. The second initiative is about multicultural adaptation, implementation, and training, and that's what we're going to hear more from Shirley here. And in a nutshell, in one sentence, is about making, scaling interventions that will be possible for low and middle income countries, right? And I'm very happy also that Paulo is here about the importance of involving lay professionals into delivering care. And I think the Brazilian unified system is well positioned to that, because even conceptually that was already part of the way the system was structured, but that did not involve adolescents and children. Right? This, it's still in adults is not that much of used in a best way sometimes. But for children are not in the healthcare sector. Children are at schools, and after 15 years, they're not even in schools because the dropout rate is 30% in Brazil. Right? The third piece is a bit of what Mike talked a bit of MindLogger and other sensors. Is about innovation and assessment and intervention. And here's what we are here to discuss: is understand a bit how we can partner with the Brazilian high risk cohort and with CISME on how these technological advancements that are being done there could also benefit people in low and middle income countries. And MindLogger is an amazing platform, an app builder. Everyone that has had an app, and me and Pedro suffered a lot on that, and all the Brazilian high risk cohort experience is that you become dependent on your developer, right? And then if you want to do something different, you can't, and then it's a nightmare. Then it's like a drama, right? So the idea that Mike had and the CMI team had is about like an app builder, so you can, and that's more amenable to mental health, so you can do interventions at a faster pace. And that's, again, the way his mind thinks. He doesn't think about, he thinks of building a tool that would be nice to solve the problem. And that's very different and very important, because multiple times we need different ways of thinking about solving the problems we have. The fourth is public awareness and engagement, and again, it's about changing public perspective and how we can engage different stakeholders. And that's not only about, it's involving donors, it's people to have attention into that, having money into that, because a lot of the problems we have is also about lack of investment. If there's no resources, change is much more difficult. The fifth element is that's one of the elements I'm very, very happy and proud that Victor is going to present for us this afternoon, is about fellowships. It's advancing the idea of having research fellows, child and adolescent psychiatry fellows, and global communicators. So it's partnering with YouTubers or people that can work with governments, for example, and do a dashboard for improving the information about mental health in children so they can make decisions. So that's the idea of the communicator. It's not only communication at the YouTube level, it's also about engaging the community into making change. And the child adolescent psychiatry fellows is also building upon the experience that Luis had in Luis internationally and Hoji nationally, which is, Hoji trained the one and only child psychiatry in Mozambique, Helena. That's a very powerful way of trying to change a system. It's also building the workforce and very difficult things to train. It's not just a course, it's a whole residency thing. So we are trying to use those kinds of ideas, and we are trying to expand, for example, in Mozambique, in training teams of people, multidisciplinary teams, and using the Brazilian experience in community care, for example, in training a psychologist and child psychiatrist, and perhaps having teams in Mozambique to be self-sufficient in training people. And that could be a very important structural role we could have in low and middle income countries in where the resources are so scarce. And the best thing is that it's the best people I have encountered so far. We are working with the Minister of Health. The level of warmness and wanting to change the system is really inspiring. And lastly, it's about expert gatherings and networking. So, it's about what we're doing here. It's about connecting to people. It's about hearing ideas and ways in which we can promote a catalyst, to be a catalyst for local change, and ways in which we can help transform realities, especially where children live. 90% of children in the world live in low and middle income countries, right? So we need to be, start paying attention to that and investing in countries such as Brazil, South Africa, Mozambique, Kenya, and etc. So with that, thank you very much. It's a Shirley one. Yes, this is Shirley.
Thanks, Giovanni. As always, very impressive. We now have finishing and concluding our morning session. We have Shirley Renolds. She's an UK-based clinical psychology, an expert in evidence-based mental health care and support for children and young people, working on how to develop and implement psychosocial therapies in low and middle-income countries. So thanks a lot, Shirley, and please the floor for you.
Thank you very much, thank you, and thank you for inviting us here today. It's a real pleasure and a delight to meet so many people and to join such an exciting day of presentations. I'm particularly looking forward to hearing the presentations later this afternoon, which are actually about low intensity task sharing interventions, and I rather wish I'd heard those first before I was about to talk. So I guess one thing to say about the task that we have at the Global Centre is that we are beginning a journey, and we are still very much in the learning phase. So part of the reason to coming today, yesterday in Porto Alegre, and all many other future and past meetings is to come and learn and hear from other people how we can best achieve our rather ambitious and a bit daunting aims. So today I'm going to focus on psychosocial interventions. It's an area that I've worked in my whole career, in the UK until now, and suddenly my vision has gone a lot wider than the UK. In the UK, although it's considered to be a high resource, high income country, we have a national health system, free at the point of delivery, that aims to deliver comprehensive health care to every member of the population. And it does a brilliant job, but it does a very poor job in relation to mental health, and it does a particularly poor job in relation to children's mental health. So one of the immediate points for me and points of learning for me is to think, well, as we're all struggling with lack of resource, what are the transferable skills and learnings that we have that we can share with each other? So I think part of our mission here at the Global Centre is not just to kind of transmit solutions from, for example, in my case, England or Ireland or Europe, but to also bring solutions back with us to our poorly resourced National Health Service and to learn from you. And we're already beginning to see ways we can do that. Okay. So today I wanted to say a little bit about the context for child and adolescent mental health. Maybe there's nothing more to say. Giovanni's already pointed out that 90% of the world's children live in low and middle income countries. And I'm going to show a graph very briefly, but we all know that 90% of the research on children and young people's mental health is carried out in high income countries. So we have a huge disparity between where children live and the knowledge and information we have about them. And, you know, I'll put some rough figures up to suggest where mental health problems are or how many of them there are in children. But as Giovanni has just pointed out, our data's poor. So even when we make estimates now about the scale of the problem, much of this is guesswork. And as he said, in Initiative 1, what we want to do is really begin to understand more about the scale of the problem that we have and the extent to which the difficulties present themselves, particularly for children in low and middle income countries. So today I want to talk really about an approach to delivering psychological interventions on scale. Obviously, traditional psychological interventions, they're effective, they're cost effective, but they're still very expensive, and they still reach a very, very, very small minority of the population in any country. So just to give you an example, in the UK it's estimated that fewer than 9% of children who have a mental health need will receive evidence-based mental health care. And maybe that 9% is more than it is here, but it's still woefully low. 91% of children are not receiving evidence-based care for mental health problems. So we also have begun to develop and think about how do we think about task-shifting approaches, what might low-intensity treatments look like, the aim being to take the elements of evidence-based treatments, the active ingredients, the components that we know work, and to scale them down in complexity and up in deliverability. So we simplify things with the aim to making them freely available, more accessible, and so that many, many more people can deliver them where children and young people live. And I want to say a little bit about the opportunities and challenges. The opportunities are huge and obvious. The challenges are huger, also obvious, and very daunting. But I think that's why we are coming here, why we want to build partnerships, why we need to learn from you, from people in South Africa, from people in Mozambique, how to overcome these challenges and why it has to be a united, collective task. Okay, so these are the kind of data that we say, that we've already pointed out, are very poor, but I think they'll do as a rough guess. 1 in 7 of the world's children and adolescents are likely to have a mental health disorder. The majority of adults who have a mental health disorder will have developed it during childhood, and about 80% of those with a diagnosis do not get any kind of treatment. And I've already referenced the fact that even if you get treatment, it's not necessarily evidence-based. So our 9%, that's in the high-income country in England, 9% get an evidence-based treatment. Maybe 20% get some kind of attention, but if it's not evidence-based, then they're probably less interested in it. And we've seen this data about where children live. I think we also have heard about high levels of stigma and discrimination, which we are hoping to address in Initiative 4. The fact that evidence-based interventions are not freely available, not easily accessible, and require high levels of skill and training, which is very expensive and hard to provide. And the workforce are lacking anyway. Even if we had treatments that we could make more freely available and disseminate, there aren't highly trained specialists. There aren't even unhighly trained specialists in most parts of the world. And most of the tools and the treatments that we've developed have been developed in high-income countries. So there's a question of cultural appropriateness and adaptability and whether or not they will be appropriate when we try and transfer them across communities, across countries, across cultures, across languages, and all those differences. So the aim of Initiative 2, which Giovanni briefly mentioned, was to make training in science-based, evidence-based, if you prefer, psychological interventions available to everybody, democratising access to education in mental health care, and increasing the number of providers, both lay and professional providers. Today, really, I'm thinking more about the lay providers, because there's always going to be a cap on the number of professional providers, and we do not have access to the purse strings to train more nurses, more psychologists, more psychiatrists, more social workers. What we can do is we can build capacity in people who live in communities with children and meet them in their everyday life. And so today, I'm probably going to say a little bit more about scaling up and increasing the number of lay providers. And there are 3 parts to the initiative. One is around multicultural adaptation, so that's working with people in their communities to adapt and to change, if necessary, the types of evidence-based treatments we already know work. To evaluate those, both in terms of feasibility and pragmatics, but also in terms of effectiveness through 2 randomised control trials that we're planning to run. And then the third part of this and the final part is around implementation and disseminating, making things freely available to anybody who would like access to them. We're focusing particularly on, to start with, in Brazil and South Africa, both of which, obviously incredibly different countries, different continents, both in the south, but united in a very high level of inequality in the people who live in those countries. And to somebody coming from the UK, where we have obvious and visible inequality as well, it is striking how unequal things can be in other countries as well. And that visible difference is something that really does kind of come as a bit of a surprise well, not a surprise, as if I knew it, but a kind of emotional surprise more than a cognitive surprise. And in South Africa, which I've spent more time in recently, partly because we have Giovanni here, who's the Brazilian expert, so he's been taking the lead pretty much in Brazil. But what we've seen, I think this is true in Brazil too, that most healthcare is delivered through primary and community centres. You have a really well-organised national federal system of delivering healthcare. I think of it as like British NHS in terms of its aims and what it's trying to do and how it's trying to do it, and that gives us something to work with, which is fantastic. But of course, the individual staff don't always feel well supported by these systems. They often work in isolated communities, they often don't have access to evidence-based training, and resources are incredibly limited. And demand is incredibly high. That always seems to be the picture when you meet staff working in health systems anywhere in the world. We can work and do a lot with primary and community health workers, and we are planning to do that, certainly. But one of the difficulties is, and I think Giovanni alluded to it, most teenagers rarely go and see a family doctor or take themselves to primary health care. Why? Well, because they're mostly physically healthy, and they see those places as places you go if you're ill in your body, but not if you have distressing images or thoughts or feelings. Where do they take those? I have no idea, but they don't take them to their primary healthcare worker. One of the other elements we really haven't spoken of very much is, and certainly I was told this in South Africa, that 70% of the population will seek their first consultation from an informal, traditional healthcare worker. So somebody who lives in their community, who has been trained in a tradition that's within their community and presents themselves as a traditional healer. If 70% of the population are going to traditional healers for their healthcare, we're probably missing an awful lot of presentations. I have no idea how we capture those, but they're a group we probably don't reach out to very much. If you do, there is systems here in Brazil. If you have a similar situation, I would really love to hear about it. So task shifting in mental health care has been developed, particularly I'm aware of it in Africa in particular, as a response to the enormous demands that HIV and AIDS placed on the health economies of sub-Saharan Africa. As a result, many different countries and many different organisations developed an approach to delivering healthcare through lay, untrained, non-specialist providers. Sometimes through training health providers to do jobs that other professionals used to do, so nurses doing jobs that doctors used to do, but often, and perhaps more interestingly from our point of view, training people who are members of the community to deliver essential elements of healthcare. And this has been done across all sorts of other health conditions. HIV and AIDS was the first, but it's worked across family planning, diabetes clinics, I said reproductive health, anyway, lots and lots of different areas, and particularly mental health. Here are two examples, both from sub-Saharan Africa. Grassroots soccer is one that particularly appeals to me because Britain has a strong soccer traditional football tradition, as we would call it. This is an organisation working across 3 different countries at the moment, where under the under the umbrella of a community football academy, where it's free and based in communities, children and their parents come in to learn skills in football. But under that, they deliver a quite comprehensive psychosocial education curriculum. And it's done in a very community-based way. It's delivered by coaches who are young people from the community that the target population come from. They're usually in their early 20s. They receive training and supervision, and they deliver psychosocial support to these kids as they come in for their football sessions. And there's a whole range of different models of this, using different kind of umbrellas of surfing, boxing, learning radio skills, hundreds of different organisations doing pretty much the same sort of thing, but all in very individual ways, because they're all funded through different types of charities and different fundraising opportunities. The friendship bench is actually targeted at adults. It comes from Zimbabwe. And here, the older members of the population, grandmothers in this particular instance, are trained to deliver problem-solving therapy in 6 sessions from a bench outside in a community setting. So it's a very open, very visible, very obvious process, but one that has been remarkably successful because it works within the culture and context it's being delivered. The problem-solving therapy is very similar, almost exactly the same as we would deliver in the UK, but the method of delivery is entirely different. Oh, sorry. And so these are just some of the many different NGOs that deliver mental health care to young people in South Africa, which is where I've been a few times. School of Hard Knocks is also a sports-based example. This is the radio workshop. And then we have things you might be familiar with, like Childline, which is a telephone service. Something called the Justice Desk, which is about interpersonal violence and human rights. This is Waves for Change that teaches a mental health curriculum through surfing. And there are many, many, many of these sorts of examples. I think my slides have gone a bit in the wrong order, but never mind. Task shifting then, as defined by the WHO, which I've already mentioned, is about redistributing healthcare tasks from trained and qualified health workers to other health workers with shorter training so that you can maximise the available resources and meet the needs of more people. And as I said already, this is because of health worker shortages, originally in relation to HIV and AIDS, but now used across a whole range of different medical health specialties. Low-intensity psychological therapies are related, very similar. It's a phrase that I've picked up from use in the UK, in England, where we've delivered low-intensity, so brief, evidence-based training to people with very much more limited training than a traditional psychological therapist. And the model in which this works, this is a UK model, I'm not suggesting it would work here, but it's a stepped care model where at the first step, general practitioners deal with the majority of problems as intended. Step 2 is where a low-intensity worker, this is somebody with fairly minimal training, delivers brief psychological interventions, often online or on the phone, sometimes face-to-face, but about 80% of consultations are done remotely, so that the access is easier for people. And they offer things like self-help, they offer unguided self-help and guided self-help, they offer computerized CBT and psychoeducational groups. So very straightforward, very simple, manualized treatments, mainly based on the CBT model. And in our psychological therapy services, approximately 70% of people walking in for psychological therapies, mental health, common mental health problems, will see a low-intensity therapist. So they now see the majority of people who walk through the door, with only approximately 30% being stepped up to a formal psychological therapy. So this is the same model that really we're talking about with task shifting. It's moving the tasks to somebody with who's cheaper to train, quicker to train, and can deliver at scale. With also using technology as well, increasingly, to deliver this to increase access. Now, there are examples in Brazil, of course, and we're going to hear more about them this afternoon, so I probably won't say any more about this, but I was pleased to discover this because all of the task shifting things I'd heard about originally were in sub-Saharan Africa. But there are, at least a number of examples, plus the ones we're going to hear about this afternoon. These strike me as low-intensity treatments in that they're shorter versions of a conventional standalone psychological therapy. So interpersonal counselling is a version of interpersonal therapy. Guided self-help for depression is a CBT-based approach, same as we use in the UK, used with both adults and older adults. What I didn't find was examples with children, but I think that's what we're going to hear about later. And there's reasonable evidence that these approaches are helping, that are worthwhile. For example, the top example is from delivering trauma-focused CBT to children and adolescents with PTSD. This is a study conducted by an American group, but with collaborators in Kenya and Tanzania. And then the second reference there is for the friendship bench, which I mentioned as the grandmothers delivering problem-solving therapy. Now, none of the data are fantastic, but they are all showing some benefits. With the friendship bench, there's a question about follow-up, and with the first one, there's a question about longevity of the training. But nonetheless, what we are seeing in fairly well-controlled trials is a positive outcome, an effective impact on mental health problems. So the sorts of task-shifting interventions that we can consider and already in practice in many different parts of the world are psychoeducation. And that's obviously something pretty straightforward, pretty simple. You can do it in lots of different ways. There are books for children, books for adults, books for teenagers. You can do it online. You can do it with apps. You can do it any way you like. Same with self-help. And guided self-help is a step up. There's very good evidence that if you provide guides or support for self-help interventions, these increase people's completion, and they vastly improve the outcomes. So guided self-help, either from a professional or a lay counsellor, is a very pragmatic, very scalable type of intervention. Giovanni's already mentioned my love of exposure for the treatment of anxiety problems, but certainly those have been delivered in a low-intensity way, exposure treatment for anxiety, behavioural activation, problem-solving, and interpersonal counselling have all been delivered in these different ways. And I'm sure there are many, many other types of interventions as well. But these are all ones for which there is some evidence of efficacy and where they've been used with children or young people. So this kind of stepped care model really would imply that we start with mental health literacy. So this would be a population-based initiative, such as we're discussing in Initiative 3 around anti-stigma, increasing everybody's understanding of children's mental health, which is relevant for teachers, parents, grandparents, mothers, aunties, uncles, anybody who ever meets or speaks to a child. We have something in the UK which is called MindEd, which is a free platform designed for any adult that ever works with children to teach them about children's mental health. It's not fantastic, but it's a sort of resource that could certainly be improved on, made better, and I think disseminated in many different parts of the world. Then we task shifting are the the next level up for where NGOs step in, where I think Giovanni suggested we should be looking at schools, and where we would hope to identify children very early with emerging mental health problems, provide support for them, and very, very brief targeted interventions for young people or parent training for parents to deliver treatments themselves. Low-intensity treatments are then probably best dealt with when you are dealing with primary care, community health workers and other health professionals, learning the problem-solving approach we spoke of earlier, or supporting guided self-help. And then at the top end, we have the existing specialist mental health workers who will be at the top to see the cases that can't be dealt with at the lower steps of the chain. All of this does suggest moving skills down, making them more widely accessible, but raises an enormous question about how you provide ongoing supervision, training, manage risk, and all of the other associated complexities. So there are lots of opportunities here. I'm just going to very briefly run through these. I think we can align any of this with an anti-stigma approach, with public health messaging to improve everybody's understanding of mental health difficulties. We can embed mental health care and knowledge into communities where children and young people actually live, where they exist, rather than in clinics that they never go to. We can begin to increase capacity right across different systems, education, health, all sorts of different places, forensic systems, perhaps the judgment systems, wherever children end up. And we can begin to capitalise on the types of technology and innovations that can deliver at scale, which we're beginning to do in the UK, but there are vastly more opportunities to do everywhere. And then we can build networks of care. So how would we make this sustainable? We will have to build networks of people to support each other in some kind of community of practice. And one of the advantages is, of course, is approach like this thinks about dealing with prevention as well as early intervention. So one would hope that beginning at the base of the pyramid, you actually begin to prevent some early emerging mental health problems. The challenges are enormous, and these are just a very few. Mechanics of scaling, how do you actually scale these things up across resources, across communities, across states, across countries? It's easy to say, well, technology is the answer, but lots of young people and lots of communities do not have access to the appropriate kind of, or the levels of interconnectivity that we take for granted. So that's not always going to be the solution. How else can we manage this? We do need to think about how we minimise harm. Any psychological intervention that is effective also has the potential to harm. And it's like anything else. If we don't look at the harms, if we don't think about harms to start with, we allow them to go unnoticed and unregulated and potentially to do more damage than we do good. Around that, then we need to think about how do we help people deliver treatments with fidelity, what kind of supervision do we need, and how do we not increase demand on the specialist services? If you put people in a stepped care model, people will not all be treated at step 1, step 2, step 3. So at step 4, how do you cope with what could potentially be increased demand? And we see that in the UK now, although the stepped care model is very effective, it also creates demand as well as dealing with a good deal of the demand. There's issues around ownership. How do we get this to belong into communities, into societies? How does it begin to be sustainable? And how do you roll it out for the long term? So obviously one of our approaches is to very much plan to disappear right from the very beginning, to build strong local partnerships, to work with the kind of groups that we've come to visit here in Brazil this week, and to try and work ways to push things out as far as they can go. We're doing something similar in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's an existing network of primary care physicians, nurses, pharmacists, and we're going to build on that network to train and build capacity in mental health. That exists already, so it's a kind of fairly safe bet. But there are going to be other strategies we need to think about, and this is, I think, where we really would value your input. How do we think about scaling? What do we do about minimising harm? How do we increase ownership? And what's the way to make sure that this whole set of work that we're hoping to do with everyone here is sustainable? And how do we make that happen in practical terms? So thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate We'd love to hear your thoughts and have you join us in this rather big adventure. Thank you.
All right, guys, very intense morning. Fantastic talks. We now end this morning session. It was really inspiring. Very hard evidence coming up to scalable solutions with the proposal of the child mind. We're going to have a very interesting afternoon as well, and I think mainly some projects, but mainly one of the projects talks a lot about what she did.
Looking forward to it.
Yes. So final messages. So we're going to have lunch over here. We have some food. And please confirm until 1 p.m. because we have to do reservations for the Don Jose Cafe. Okay?
Can you carry that down?
Yeah. And please, okay. Please, let's try to make everyone at the end. Thanks.
Pode tirar a transmissão.